having gotten the bill than not gotten it. But long term, if this bill can be made to work, and there are big questions around the implementation of it and about some of the practicalities, but if he can extend this benefit that will have all sorts of positive long-run consequences for the economy, it'll make the workforce more mobile, it'll keep people won't be tied down in jobs for fear of losing health care. They'll be able to set up their own businesses and work independently. I mean, the problem, the difficulty of getting and keeping private health care in America is a tremendous downward drag on the economy. So I think we're going to see benefits from that. And the big question is whether it, as the phrase goes, bends the cost curve, which essentially means that America, in addition to having healthcare that's tremendously expensive, about twice as expensive in terms of GDP as it is in Britain, has this tremendous healthcare inflation. And we're now at 17% of GDP. And if you project that to grow at the rate it's been growing, it sort of absorbs not only the entire government, but the entire economy. If Obama can turn that curve in the other direction, it'll be a huge accomplishment on top of extending coverage.
I think for most Europeans looking at America, we follow your arguments and your enthusiasm absolutely.
Yeah.
What we find more difficult to do, and you might be able to help us with, is what was the fundamental basis of the American right's objection to it? Does it attack? We see the American right characterizing Europe as socialist.
Right.
Tell David Cameron that.
Yeah, exactly.
But is there a sense that this is a threat to some deeply held values on the right?
Yes. What it's not about is what's in the healthcare bill. I think very few people even know what's in the healthcare bill, including a lot of legislators who voted on it. What it is about is the role of government, the size of government, the scope of government, and it is a deep part of American political culture to be suspicious of government, to be suspicious of the central government, of the federal government, of Washington, and to want to keep it from getting bigger. That is a kind of reflexive position for Republicans now. And I don't discredit that idea completely. I mean, I think America does have a political culture in part because government is a smaller share of the economy. I mean, in recent history, American government is about a third of GDP. In Northern Europe, it's closer to half of GDP. That's a big difference in terms of how much of people's own money they're able to keep, what tax rates are like, how much freedom they have, because a bigger state is, I think, in some ways, intrinsically more of a heavy-handed state. So I think there's a genuine philosophical disagreement, and I don't think Republicans are wrong to be concerned by the runaway growth of government, because government has just expanded tremendously in the United States, as in Britain, in response to the financial crisis. In the US this year, government will be close to 45% of GDP. And there's a question about how it's going to come back down and whether it's going to come back down. So the way I read the message from Republicans is not necessarily that they don't believe that government should have a role in providing health care. Of course, ironically, government provides about half of health care already, and the Republicans were in the position of saying this new bill would damage Medicare, which is the second biggest government program of all already. But I think it really is this deeper concern about runaway growth of federal government and federal power.
Can you, in relation to that, can you help us to understand what the nature of the Tea Party movement is? Is it a real force in American politics, and what is the relationship between the kind of rugged individualist libertarianism that you've described on the right and religion?
Yeah, well, I think the Tea Party, combines a lot of things, and a lot of people who probably wouldn't agree about a lot. So I'm not sure it does represent a set of coherent views. For example, you have this tension that runs right through the middle of libertarianism between leave us alone both socially and economically, which is a consistent libertarian position, and the more Christian evangelist anti-government position, which says we do want restrictions on abortion, we do want government to not advance gay rights, to not be involved in all sorts of social issues, to let us teach our children that Darwin was wrong, or might have been wrong, but at the same time is against the expansion of government. And one of the ironies of that, of course, is that the parts of the country that stand to benefit the most from the health care bill are often the most against it. You know, the southern states, the poorest states in the country, are the places where it's most unpopular.
Is that because the church effectively competes with government for security and that sense of security?
Well, that's an interesting thought. You know, of course, to describe it as the church, I mean, there are many different kinds of evangelical churches, and also, you know, people who don't necessarily go to any church and, you know, may get their main infusion of religion by watching televangelists on TV. You know, not to stereotype or characterize, but, you know, we're not dealing with a powerful alternative force. I think we're dealing more with a kind of consciousness and way of life. But so the Tea Party is, you know, is filled, as sort of I've read about it, with all of these contradictions that are sort of interesting, but I wouldn't bet on it to turn into a coherent movement. I think it's a kind of populist reaction. It's a way of saying, no, we don't like what's happening. And it also is a strong, culturally anti-elitist movement. It's a rejection of people who, you know, the idea that there are people in Washington and in the media who think they know what's best for us, and we don't like it, and we don't agree.
In respect to that, it seems as if Sarah Palin was almost chosen by the Republican Party to speak to that constituency. Is this a clever move by the Republican Party, or is this a Republican Party that's been completely taken over by its base?
Well, I think Republicans are, to characterize as a whole, both horrified and impressed by Sarah Palin. I mean, on the one hand, they see that how well she expresses this kind of populism, this anti-elitist position, that there's this sort of instinctive sympathy a lot of people on the right have for. At the same time, you know, I think any serious person had recognized she was just wildly unqualified to be an office holder. I mean, she wasn't just unqualified to be vice president, she was unqualified to be the mayor of Wasilla, Alaska. She doesn't know what she's talking about. And you know, would be the idea of her holding national office is in fact quite scary. And I think the more, you know, sort of responsible, the remaining responsible factions, fast shrinking of the Republican Party, were really horrified by her.
Do you think that modern politics has to be personality-based?
No, and in fact, it's not my instinctive approach. You know, my background is in writing about policy and ideas in politics. And when I set out to write a Bush about Bush, I sort of thought, my premise was that, well, people haven't paid close enough attention to what he really thinks, and I want to look at that very closely. I want to look at his religious ideas. I want to look at his political ideas. But in fact, that didn't get you very far, because his idea, he didn't have any religious ideas. You know, he had a kind of religious faith that he had used to deal with his alcoholism and so on, but there was no content to it whatsoever. And similarly with his political ideas. But what he did have was this sort of intense family dynamic that had clearly, you know, driven him in both the sort of positive and negative of his life. So I was just sort of drawn into that, and that sort of psychological view and that relational view turned out to be, you know, I thought the key to understanding him. So, you know, I mean, my wife always said, well, how can you do that? You don't understand anything about psychology. But, you know, for me, it was an example of going where the story leads.
So it's UK election season here, and
yeah.
We've been regaled with the extremely professional public relations versions of our leaders' marriages, their personal lives. The wives have become great characters in the election drama. Is this, as it were, the manipulation of an instinct which says what's important here is the character of the leader? And is this something that we should be resisting? Is this something that modern political institutions can resist?
I don't resist it very hard. I mean, I would resist some of the gossip and some of the superficial explanation, but I do think the character does matter in politics. Ideas matter in politics. How people are made up, how they think, how they've related to the key people in their lives is one of the ways you can understand them. And I think more and more, my view is that, you know, it's very hard to understand politicians just in relation to their views and their policies. And so, you know, I don't resist that kind of interpretation. I just argue you should do it quite seriously.